A woman walking alone through a hospital parking garage at 4 in the morning. Keys in one hand. Exhaustion in every line of her shoulders. Officer Curtis Boone looked at her scrubs. Her hoodie. The empty rows of luxury sedans around her, and decided she didn't belong to any of them. He was wrong in a way that would end his career before the sun came up, because the woman he threw against her own car that night held a rank that outranked half the chain of command. He answered to, and a single phone call from a holding cell was about to bring the United States Army through his precinct's front doors. Ashford Grove was the kind of suburb that had built its entire identity around a single institution. Ashford Regional Medical Center. A sprawling glass and steel campus that anchored the town's economy, its property values, and in an arrangement most residents didn't know existed, a significant portion of its police department's budget. 3 years earlier, in a cost-cutting move, the town council had approved with barely a second thought. Ashford Grove PD had signed a private security contract with the hospital system officers on off-duty rotation would patrol the medical campus after dark. And the hospital would pay the department a bonus for every incident, prevented a phrase vague enough to reward almost anything. An officer chose to write up. Nobody on the council had asked what would happen when that incentive met an officer who was already looking for reasons to prove himself. Officer Curtis Boone was 38 years old. 12 years into a career that had stalled somewhere around year 7. Watching younger officers with cleaner files get pulled up for detective assignments while he stayed on patrol. He had picked up as many hospital campus shifts as the schedule would allow, because the bonus pay added up, and because a solid file of incidents prevented was, in his mind, exactly the kind of thing that finally got a man noticed. He had 4 citizen complaints sitting in a folder in Chief Walter Briggs's cabinet, none of them ever making it past a first read, because the department's insurer had a lawyer who made complaints evaporate the way hospital contracts made budget shortfalls evaporate. It was 410 a.m. on a Wednesday in early November, the kind of hour when the hospital campus felt less like a place of healing and more like a small, silent city of its own vending machines, humming, elevators chiming in empty lobbies, the parking structure lit in the flat, sourceless glow of fluorescent tubes that made everyone under them look slightly grey. Boone sat in his cruiser at the mouth of the doctor's reserved lot on level 3. Engine off. Thermos of gas station coffee balanced on the dash. Beside him sat Officer Lena Ruiz, 26. 7 months out of the academy, working her first solo rotation on the hospital contract and still not entirely sure what incident prevented was supposed to mean in practice. There, Boone said, straightening in his seat, setting his coffee down carefully so it wouldn't spill on the console. As a figure emerged from the stairwell at the far end of the level, a woman, mid-40s, walking at a slow, deliberate pace between the rows of parked cars, dressed in wrinkled blue scrubs under an oversized grey hoodie, a canvas tote bag over one shoulder, checking something on her phone and then looking back up at the cars around her. That's probably just staff, Ruiz said. Nurse getting off a shift. Maybe. At 4 in the morning, walking slow through the doctor's lot, checking her phone between every row. Boone shook his head. That's not somebody going to their own car. That's somebody looking for the right car to get into. We've had 3 break-ins on this level in the last 2 months. She's in scrubs. Curtis. Anybody can buy scrubs at a uniform store. Boone said, already reaching for the door handle. Let's go find out what she's really doing up here. Inside the tote bag slung over her shoulder, alongside her house keys and a half-eaten protein bar, was Dr. Naomi Ward's hospital ID badge, which she had, against every habit of 20 years, forgotten to clip back onto her scrubs after peeling off her surgical gown for the last time that shift. She was 45 years old, chief of trauma surgery at Ashford Regional, and had just finished the tail end of a 20-hour stretch that had started with a multi-vehicle collision on the interstate and ended with a gunshot wound that had come in 40 minutes before her shift was supposed to end. She was tired in the specific, hollowed-out way that only came after standing over an open chest cavity for 3 hours. And she was walking the long way to her car, level by level, because she genuinely could not remember, in her exhaustion, which floor she had parked on. She did not see the cruiser's headlights sweep across the concrete pillars until they were already stopped directly behind her. And by the time she turned, Officer Boone was already out of the vehicle and closing the distance with the kind of aggressive, rolling stride she recognized from every account she'd ever read about exactly this situation happening to someone else. "Hold it right there," Boone called out, one hand resting on his duty belt. Naomi stopped walking. 20 years of trauma medicine had trained her to assess a scene in under 2 seconds: vitals, threats, exits, and what she assessed now was an agitated man with a weapon on his hip and a rookie hanging back near the cruiser, looking uncertain. She kept her hands visible, at her sides, and did not reach for her bag. "Good morning, officer," she said. Her voice was level, low, the same register she used to talk a panicking family member through the words, "We did everything we could. Is there a problem? What are you doing up here? I just finished a shift. I'm looking for my car." "You don't know where your own car is. I've been on shift for 20 hours. Naomi said. "I genuinely don't remember what level I parked on. I was checking my phone for the parking app." Boone's flashlight came up, sweeping over her face. Her hoodie. The tote bag. "You got hospital ID." Here was the detail that would matter more than anything else that happened in the next 90 minutes. Her badge was in the bag, not clipped to her scrubs. And in the raw fatigue of the moment, reaching slowly into a bag in front of an agitated officer, with his hand on his holster, felt, to every instinct she had, like the single most dangerous thing she could do. "It's in my bag," she said. "I'd like to reach for it slowly, if that's all right. I don't want any misunderstanding about my hands moving." "Stay right where you are," Boone said, and something in his voice had shifted from suspicion into something closer to triumph, as if her caution had confirmed exactly what he'd already decided about her before he ever got out of the car. "We've had break-ins on this level." Woman in a hoodie, walking slow, checking her phone. "No visible ID. That's the profile. I work here," Naomi said, keeping her voice even despite the cold spike of fury settling into her chest. "I am the chief of trauma surgery at this hospital. My badge is in my bag. I would be glad to show you, if you'll let me reach for it." "Chief of surgery," Boone repeated, and the disbelief in his tone was not subtle. He looked her up and down the wrinkled scrubs, the exhausted eyes, the dark skin under the flat garage lighting, and made a decision that had nothing to do with anything she had actually said. "Turn around. Hands on the vehicle." "Officer, I have done nothing that warrants this, and I want that on the record," Naomi said. She had said versions of this sentence to families in crisis 1,000 times. The calm, declarative voice that keeps a room from spiraling. It did not work the way it usually did. "I am complying, but I am telling you clearly that I have not committed any offense." "Save it," Boone said, and grabbed her arm harder than the movement required, spinning her toward the hood of a nearby Lexus that belonged, though he did not know it, to the hospital's chief of anesthesiology. He patted her down roughly, yanking the tote bag off her shoulder and dumping its contents onto the trunk of her own car keys. Protein bar wrapper, a paperback novel, and, sliding out from beneath a folded sweater, her hospital ID lanyard. Badge photo, clearly visible under the harsh fluorescent light. Officer Ruiz, who had come up behind them, caught sight of the badge before Boone did. "Curtis," she said quietly. That's her ID. It says Chief of Trauma Surgery right there. Anybody can print a badge. Boone said, though something in his certainty had already begun to fray at the edges. He scooped the lanyard up and shoved it into his own jacket pocket, rather than looking at it properly. We're not taking chances. Cuff her. I am not resisting, Naomi said, loudly enough for Ruiz to hear clearly. I am completely compliant. This is unnecessary force. The cuffs snapped, shut around her wrists, tight enough to bite into skin that had, 20 minutes earlier, been steadying a scalpel over a stranger's heart. Naomi did not fight it. She had spent 2 decades training herself to separate the animal instinct, to resist from the tactical calculation of what resistance would actually cost her. And in a dim parking structure at 4 a.m, with an agitated man's hand still hovering near his weapon, the calculation was not close. You are making a serious mistake. Officer Boone, Naomi said, reading his name tag as he pulled her upright. Her voice did not rise. If anything, it dropped, taking on the same flat, unhurried register she used when a trauma bay went from chaos to procedure. I am asking you, clearly, to stop this before it becomes something neither of us can undo. Tell it to the sergeant, Boone said, and walked her toward the cruiser. The Ashford Grove precinct at 4:40 inches the morning had the particular hush of a building running on its skeleton crew, a desk sergeant nursing bad coffee, a dispatcher half watching a bank of monitors, the low electric hum of fluorescent light. Sergeant Owen Trask looked up as Boone walked a handcuffed woman in surgical scrubs through the booking doors, and something about the scene made him set down his crossword before he'd finished reading the clue. What we got? Suspicious activity. Hospital, lot. No verified ID at the scene, Boone said, which was, technically, not a lie, though it left out the part where the ID had, in fact, been sitting in his own jacket pocket for the last 15 minutes. I am the Chief of Trauma Surgery at Ashford Regional, Naomi said, her voice carrying clearly across the booking area. My identification is in that officer's pocket. I would like it entered into the record, and I am entitled to a phone call, which I am requesting now. Trask glanced at Boone, who shrugged and pulled the lanyard from his jacket, tossing it onto the counter with a studied carelessness that didn't quite land. Trask picked it up, looked at the badge photo, looked at the woman standing in front of him, and felt the first faint prickle of unease that seasoned desk sergeants develop after enough years of watching things go sideways. You're really the chief of surgery over there. I am, and I've had a 20-hour shift, Sergeant. So I would very much like that phone call before we go any further. You'll get it after processing, Trask said. Not unkindly it was. After all, simply how things were done in this building, and had Ruiz lead her back to a holding cell. Naomi sat on the cold metal bench, wrists throbbing, and did the thing she had trained herself to do in every crisis. For 20 years she catalogued badge numbers, timestamps, the exact wording of what had been said, not out of anger, though the anger was there, banked low and controlled beneath the exhaustion, but because she understood, with total clarity, that the difference between a story that got believed and a story that got dismissed was almost always a matter of precision. 11 minutes later, Officer Ruiz appeared at the bars, glancing over her shoulder toward the front office. Dr. Ward, I checked the hospital staff directory on my phone. You're listed. Chief of Trauma Surgery. Hired 6 years ago. She hesitated. I don't understand why he kept going after he saw the badge. What's your name? Officer Ruiz. Lena Ruiz. Officer Ruiz. I need my phone call. And I need it now. Ruiz walked to the front desk without waiting to be told, retrieved the wireless handset, and carried it back to the cell. Naomi did not call a lawyer, and she did not call her husband, though both calls would come later. She dialed a number she had memorized the day she accepted her commission 11 years earlier. A number that existed for exactly this kind of night. Army Medical Command duty line. This is Major Feldman. This is Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Ward. Army Reserve Medical Corps. Currently detailed to the Defense Health Agency's Combat Casualty Research Program. Verification code, Bravo 41 Tango. A pause. The sound of a keyboard. Code verified. Ma'am. Your secure device pinged an emergency contact flag 6 minutes ago from a fixed location in Ashford Grove. What's your status? I am currently detained in a holding cell at the Ashford Grove Police Department. I was subjected to an unlawful stop in my own hospital's parking structure, forcibly restrained, and taken into custody after my hospital credentials were seized and disregarded by the arresting officer. I need this escalated as a security incident involving cleared personnel, not logged as a routine call. There was a silence on the line that lasted 2 full seconds too long. Ma'am, they cuffed you with your ID in hand. Affirmative. Get me Colonel Renata Ford at the Provost Marshal's office, if she's reachable. And flag my research clearance status for the Defense Health Agency Security Office. I may be delayed for this morning's briefing. I'm patching you through now. Ma'am, sit tight. 35 miles away. At the district's Army installation, Colonel Renata Ford, Deputy Provost Marshal. A 19-year veteran of military law enforcement who had personally investigated threats against cleared medical and research personnel on 3 continents, was 3 hours into a paperwork-heavy night shift when the words, "cleared personnel," unlawfully detained, came across her secure line. She had exactly 1 gear for that phrase, wake the duty JAG officer. She told the deputy at the next desk, already reaching for her jacket, and get me 2 response vehicles. We're rolling on Ashford Grove. Colonel. That's a municipal holding cell. You want an Army response team going into a civilian precinct. I want us in that lobby within the hour. Ford said, checking her credentials. Somebody in that department just detained a lieutenant colonel with an active DoD research clearance and confiscated her identification rather than verify it. That is not a grey area. That is a security incident with federal implications. And I intend to treat it like one. She called the installation's commanding general from the road, laid out the situation in 4 flat sentences. And by the time her convoy reached the outskirts of Ashford Grove, an FBI civil rights liaison notified as a matter of course whenever a federal clearance holder reported unlawful detention had joined the response as well. Light bars carving through the pre-dawn dark like a slow, deliberate storm front. Back in the holding cell, Naomi sat with her eyes closed, running through the same calm architecture of thought she brought to every crisis, not fury, which accomplished nothing, but the precise sequence of what had happened and what it would cost the people who had done it. Unlawful stop, without articulable suspicion. Seizure of valid identification. Continued detention after the badge was in the arresting officer's own hands. She did not need to raise her voice. The paperwork would do the raising for her. The rumble reached the precinct before the lights did a low vibration through the floor that rattled Sergeant Trask's coffee mug, hard enough that he set down his pen and walked to the front window. What he saw made him go very still. 2 matte grey Army vehicles and an unmarked federal sedan rolling into the small lot, blocking the exits with the unhurried precision of people who had done this before and never once needed to think about it. Armed personnel in tactical gear fanned out along the perimeter without a raised voice among them. The front doors opened before anyone touched them, and Colonel Renata Ford walked in first, tall, grey-eyed, built with the compact economy of a career soldier, radiating the kind of stillness that made rooms go quiet on their own. Behind her came an FBI civil rights attorney named Marcus Feldstein, carrying a leather folio, and 2 more military police in tactical gear. I am Colonel Renata Ford. United States Army, she announced, and the words filled the small lobby the way a foghorn fills a harbor. I am here for Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Ward. Officer Boone came out of the break room with a fresh cup of coffee. And the coffee stopped mattering the moment he registered the tactical vests, the vehicles through the glass, the sheer physical fact of federal and military law enforcement standing in his lobby before sunrise. What is this? He said, and it came out much smaller than he meant it to. Ford closed the distance in 5 unhurried steps. Are you the officer who detained Dr. Ward? This was a legitimate stop. She was acting suspicious in a restricted lot. No visible. She had her identification in her bag. And your officer took it and put it in his own pocket rather than verify it. Ford said, Where is it now? Boone's hand went, unthinking, to his jacket, where the lanyard still sat. He said nothing, which was answer enough. I saw the whole thing, said Officer Ruiz, stepping forward from near the filing cabinets. Her arms crossed tight over her chest. She told him where her ID was before he even touched her. He found it during the pat-down, saw what it said, and cuffed her anyway. I confirmed she's on the hospital staff directory before we even left the garage. Lena Boone started. No, she said, her voice cracking but holding. I'm not covering for this. Marcus Feldstein opened his folio on the booking counter with the crisp finality of a man laying down documents that had already won the argument. Officer Boone, you unlawfully detained a commissioned Army officer with an active federal security clearance, confiscated her identification rather than acknowledge it, and continued her detention after that identification was in your possession. That is a matter with serious federal implications. Whatever jurisdiction you believe you're standing in. Sergeant Trask was already moving down the hallway with his keys. The cell door screeched open, and there sat Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Ward. Wrists faintly bruised. Scrubs still wrinkled from a 20-hour shift. Sitting with a stillness that made the small concrete room feel, for a moment, like the calmest place in the building. Colonel Ford stopped at the bars and allowed something like relief to cross her face for the first time that morning. Colonel Ward, my apologies for the delay. Good to see you. Colonel, Naomi said, rising slowly, rolling one shoulder where the cuffs had pulled at the joint. I take it my beacon did its job. It did. Ma'am, we'll need that badge back. And we're going to need a conversation with this department before we leave. Naomi stepped out of the cell and looked at Officer Ruiz, who stood rigid by the filing cabinets, eyes bright. Officer Ruiz. Ma'am, I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry. You told the truth in a room that didn't want to hear it. Naomi said, That's harder than most people ever have to find out. Don't let this morning convince you it wasn't worth doing. She turned to Boone, who stood pale near the break room door, the lanyard still sitting uselessly in his pocket. You had my identification in your hand. Officer Boone, the truth was in your hand, and you chose not to look at it, because looking at it meant admitting you'd already decided who I was before I said a word. That is not a policing failure. That is a character failure. And it does not stay contained to one parking garage. Boone opened his mouth and found, for the first time in 12 years of talking his way through complaints, that he had nothing to say. Chief Walter Briggs arrived at the station 9 minutes later, having broken every speed law in the town he policed, and walked into a lobby that looked like a federal training exercise. Military vehicles in his lot, his desk sergeant standing rigid, a woman in surgical scrubs being escorted out by an army colonel, and, standing frozen against the wall, Curtis Boone, the officer whose overtime hours on the hospital contract Briggs had personally approved every single week for the last 8 months. What in God's name is happening in my department? Briggs demanded, Feldstein turned to face him without hurry. "Chief Briggs, your officer detained a commissioned army officer with an active federal clearance and disregarded her identification. That alone is a serious matter. It's also prompted us to take a closer look at your hospital security contract, more broadly, specifically the incentive structure that pays your officers bonuses for stops made on that campus. Which, I'll note, creates exactly the kind of pressure that leads to nights like this one." Briggs's face went the color of old paper. "That contract funds a third of our patrol budget. We'll be the judge of whether it continues to," Ford said, and there was nothing in her tone suggesting she was joking. "Starting this morning. This incident is under review by both Army CID and the FBI's Civil Rights Division. I'd recommend full cooperation, Chief, because the alternative is considerably worse." Naomi, walking toward the door, flanked by 2 military police, paused beside Briggs just long enough to say, in the same level voice she'd used all night, "Your officer arrested the surgeon who operated on your son's collapsed lung 11 weeks ago. Chief Briggs, I don't say that to embarrass you. I say it because it's the clearest illustration I can give you of exactly how little your department actually knew about who it was profiling on that campus." Briggs did not have an answer for that either. Naomi walked out into the grey pre-dawn light, past the military vehicles, past federal agents, securing the perimeter of a department that no longer had any illusions about its own permanence, and did not look back. The review moved with the speed reserved for cases that could not be allowed to look slow. Within days, Army CID investigators and FBI civil rights attorneys had pulled 18 months of the hospital security contract's incident logs and found a pattern that was not subtle. A disproportionate share of incidents prevented bonus payments, traced directly to stops involving hospital staff of color, nurses and technicians, and, in one earlier case that had never been reported up the chain, a black anesthesiology resident stopped twice in 4 months for loitering near his own car. Colonel Ford sat in on the interview when Boone, stripped of his badge and facing federal civil rights charges, was brought in for formal questioning. He was a smaller man in that chair than he had been in the lobby. "You had her identification in your hand," the FBI investigator across from him said, sliding a photograph of the lanyard across the table. "Explain why a 12-year veteran doesn't verify a badge the second he's holding it." "I'd already decided," Boone said quietly, staring at the table. "Before I ever got out of the car. Once I'd made the call in my head. Nothing was going to change it. Not even the badge in my own pocket." "That's the most honest thing you've said all week," the investigator replied, and closed the folder, 2 doors down. Investigators from Colonel Ford's office sat with the black anesthesiology resident, whose 2 earlier stops had never made it into any official log. His name was Dr. Samuel Okafor, and he had spent the 18 months since his second stop convinced that reporting it would cost him more than staying quiet ever would. "I didn't think anyone would believe me over an officer," Okafor told them, turning a coffee cup slowly between his hands. "The first time, he said I fit a description. Young man, dark jacket, walking near cars that weren't mine. The second time there wasn't even a description. He just said I looked like I didn't belong there at that hour. I complained to my department chair informally. Nothing ever came of it. And I stopped bringing it up because I had a fellowship to finish, and I didn't want to be the resident who made trouble. You're not making trouble now, Dr. Okafor," the lead investigator said gently. "You're the reason this pattern has a shape instead of just being one very bad morning." Okafor's statement, cross-referenced against Boone's own body camera archive, which the department had never deleted. Apparently never imagining anyone would think to look confirmed, both stops in granular detail, the vague, shifting justifications, the absence of any actual complaint or suspicious activity report from hospital security. The way each encounter had ended, not in an arrest, but in exactly the kind of prolonged, humiliating detainment that left no paper trail because nothing had technically gone far enough to require one. It was, investigators would later note in their report, the exact same pattern that had nearly played out with Dr. Wood, interrupted only by the accident of her rank and clearance, rather than by anything the department's own procedures had been designed to catch. Chief Briggs, questioned separately about the contract's incentive structure, tried to argue the bonus payments had never been intended to encourage profiling, only diligence, an argument that collapsed the moment investigators produced 18 months of data showing white staff members were stopped at a fraction of the rate of everyone else on the same campus. Doing the same late-night walks to the same parking structure, Officer Lena Ruiz was not charged with anything. The U.S. Attorney's Office made a point of publicly distinguishing between officers who had participated in the pattern and the one officer who told the truth the moment federal investigators arrived. She resigned from Ashford Grove PD within the month and was recruited, on Colonel Ford's personal recommendation, into a regional law enforcement accountability unit the following spring work. She told friends that felt like the first thing she'd done on the job that actually mattered. The hospital, facing its own scrutiny for the incentive structure it had funded, terminated the security contract entirely within 2 weeks and replaced it with an unarmed campus safety program run by its own staff, trained explicitly in de-escalation rather than incident quotas. The town council, facing a budget hole where a third of the patrol division's overtime funding had been, held an emergency session that ran past midnight. Councilwoman Patricia Alvarez, who had voted for the original contract 3 years earlier without reading past the executive summary, was the one who finally asked the question none of her colleagues wanted to put on the record. How many incident reports did we actually generate off that contract in 3 years? And how many of them led to an actual arrest for an actual crime? Versus how many of them were just somebody getting stopped and let go with nothing on paper? When the numbers came back the following week, provided under subpoena, since the department itself had never bothered to compile them, the ratio was stark enough that even the council members who had wanted to quietly renegotiate the contract's terms instead voted to end it outright. Chief Briggs's resignation was on the table before the meeting adjourned. Sergeant Owen Trask, who had processed the booking that night without ever raising his voice or crossing a line himself, kept his position under the department's new interim leadership, in part because his own instinct, the small, nagging unease that had made him actually read the ID lanyard rather than simply file. It was the only thing in the entire incident report that investigators later pointed to as evidence the old department hadn't been entirely beyond saving. 6 months later, in a federal courtroom, 2 counties over, Curtis Boone stood for sentencing on charges of deprivation of rights under color of law. The gallery held reporters, hospital colleagues of Dr. Ward's, and, in the second row, the black anesthesiology resident, whose 2 earlier stops buried for years in a filing cabinet no one had bothered to look in, had finally been entered into the record as evidence of a pattern rather than dismissed as isolated incidents. The federal prosecutor, a soft-spoken woman named Adiez Colton, who had spent a decade building civil rights cases most people never heard about because they never escalated into anything as visible as an army colonel storming a precinct, stood to address the court before sentencing. Your Honor, the temptation in a case like this is to treat it as an aberration. 1 officer, 1 bad morning, 1 contract with a flawed incentive structure, Colton said, but the evidence shows something more durable than that. Dr. Okafor was stopped twice, informally, quietly, and told himself it wasn't worth the fight. He was right to believe that, because for 18 months, nothing about how this department operated gave him any reason to believe otherwise. What changed wasn't the officer's judgment. It was the rank of the next person he happened to stop. That is not justice functioning correctly and encountering a bad actor. That is a system that only corrects itself when the person it wrongs happens to have the power to make it listen. Dr. Ward had submitted a written statement rather than speak in person, which the prosecutor read into the record at the court's invitation, that the true cost of a single unlawful stop was never contained to the person stopped, that it radiated outward into every colleague who had quietly absorbed a smaller version of the same humiliation and decided it wasn't worth reporting, and that real accountability meant asking not what happened to the officer who made the stop, but whether the institution around him had been built in a way that made the stop almost inevitable. The federal judge did not need long to reach her sentence. You held the truth in your own hand. Mr. Boone, she said, looking down from the bench, and you chose not to look at it, because looking at it meant admitting you were wrong about a woman before she'd said a word. That choice did not just end your career. It exposed a system that had been quietly rewarding officers for treating hospital staff as suspects rather than colleagues. For years. Until one of those officers happened to stop the wrong person on the wrong morning, and she had the standing to make sure it was finally looked at. I sentence you to 8 years in federal prison. Boone did not look back at the gallery as marshals led him out, on a cold, clear morning, the following February. 15 months after she had sat in a holding cell with her wrists bruised and her badge sitting uselessly in another man's pocket. Dr. Naomi Ward walked out of Ashford Regional Medical Center at the end of another long shift. Scrubs wrinkled. Exhaustion settled into her shoulders the way it always did at the end of a hard night. The doctor's lot had new lighting now. Brighter. Fewer shadows between the rows. And a small unarmed safety officer, in a soft blue jacket, nodded to her from his golf cart near the elevator bank. Morning. Dr. Ward. Need an escort to your car. I'm all right this morning. Marcus. Thank you. She walked the familiar rows to her car, unhurried, and stood for a moment beside it before getting in. Looking back at the hospital's lit windows against the dark sky, the same hospital, the same campus, but a version of it now that had been forced, in the end, to become something closer to what it had always claimed to be. She thought, not with anger, which had never been useful to her in an OR or anywhere else, but with the same clear-eyed precision she brought to every diagnosis, about how close the whole quiet machinery of that contract had come to grinding on indefinitely, simply because no one with the standing to be believed had ever been made to stand in a holding cell and prove it. She thought, too, about Samuel Okafor, who had finished his fellowship the previous spring and taken a staff position at a hospital 2 states away. In a city he'd chosen partly, he'd admitted to her once over coffee in the surgeon's lounge, because he wanted to start somewhere that didn't already have a story attached to his name. She had written him a recommendation letter longer than the position technically required, because some debts were not the kind that closed out cleanly on their own timeline, and because she understood, better than most people ever would, that the quiet cost of being disbelieved twice and staying silent was not something a policy change alone could repair. She got into her car, started the engine, and drove home through the grey early light, in no hurry at all. If a story like this reminds you why accountability matters, hit that like button. Share it with someone who believes nobody should be judged by what they're wearing at 4 in the morning. And subscribe for more true-to-life stories of justice finally catching up. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Dr. Ward's position?